Greetings and welcome to the Richard Dolan Show, where every week we fight the good fight. Very happy to be here with you again. I missed last week. Happy to be back here with you now for a live video version of the program. As I've done sometimes in the past, I'm doing this one solo. If you followed me for any period of time, you know I often like to do a solo show, and that's what I've got going on for you tonight. This is about... I'm just going to title this The End of UFO Research. You'll see why in a moment, but I'm talking about the future of UFO research, because UFO research is not at an end, not by any means. If you check for UFO sightings online, you're going to find thousands of reports being submitted to websites every year. Mainly in the US, you've got MUFON and you've got the National UFO Reporting Center. Talked about those both quite a lot. When you add up the sightings that those two websites get every year, you're going to get more than 10,000 UFO sightings per year in North America alone. And when you read the details of many of these sightings, not all of them are that exciting, to be honest about it. Often there's nothing in there that's specific, or they're only mildly interesting. But there are always good ones in there, or at least potentially good ones, because very few ever really get investigated. It's often a question of what percentage of these sightings are genuinely anomalous objects that, as we like to ask ourselves, may not come from around these parts of the local galaxy, right? That's the thing we wonder. How many of these UFO sightings are actually genuine UFOs that are not from here? And no one's really ever had a definitive answer to what that percentage is. You often hear people say it's 5%, which, okay, fine, maybe that's what it is. I've often thought the number is a little higher than that. But if you even just take the 5% figure, and if you're going off of 10,000 sightings of UFOs in North America alone each year, you would end up with 500 really good UFO sightings in North America every single year at a minimum. And look, that's more than one per day. And in fact, if you go through the NUFORC or the MUFON website, you will undoubtedly find at least one really good sighting every day. Now, on top of that, we really have no clue as to how many people around the world are seeing UFOs. Mainly because the rest of the world doesn't have good reporting mechanisms in place. Some are a little better than others, but none really have any kind of website where just anyone can go and report. I think, though, we can assume that people are seeing things everywhere, since we get reports from pretty much everywhere in the world, even though I think a lot are lost. So in all likelihood, if we had a worldwide UFO reporting system in place, so something that truly anyone in the world could use and report to, it wouldn't surprise me to see well over 100,000 reports being made every year. 100,000 easy. And if you take the 5% rule, well, that would be, 5,000 great sightings every year. Or I did the math on this one, 13 a day of excellent quality sightings around the world. So when you think of potential numbers like this, it would make us think that there's a tremendous future for UFO research and investigation. Certainly the potential is there, and the future should be there. And yet I have to ask, are we at the end of the UFO era? And what I mean is that if this were the 1940s or the 1950s, or even the 1980s or 1990s, and if you were to see an unusual aerial object like a flying disc or a triangle or a boomerang-shaped object or a strange ball of light that maneuvers over your house or anything like that, you would be pretty strongly inclined, I should think, to assume that this is something from another civilization altogether, something different than what we humans have been developing. Because back through all of those decades of the 20th century, aerial traffic was pretty consistent, and none of it was really supposed to look like a flattened disc or a triangle or what have you. The objects all made standard identifiable sounds, whether they were airplanes or helicopters or, well, that was pretty much all that we have had up there in the skies. Sure, you get the occasional military or scientific test, but generally the tech that we were developing through all those years was not at any level that would confuse people with flying saucers. As far as we know, even today, this was the case. We don't have any confirmed ultra advanced technology from those from any part of the 20th century that we can use to explain any more than a small fraction of UFO sightings at that time. So for that reason, detecting, if you were to see strange aerial phenomena at that time, any time in the 20th century, that would be and that was the number one form of evidence that people would use to make the assumption that we've got non-humans here. We've got extraterrestrials. It's all about unknown aerial objects. We all know that. But if you stop and think about it, that form of evidence wouldn't necessarily be the main way to go about this sort of thing, to prove that aliens are here, in other words. I mean, yes, unexplainable objects in the sky are a reasonable thing to be looking at, and you can definitely make inferences from them. And there are, if you've studied any bit of UFO history, there are so many countless examples of very bizarre aerial phenomena that there's not an easy terrestrial explanation for. So I'm going to give you one, and only one here, because then we're going to move on. And that's one that I've always rather liked. That's the Belgian Congo uranium mine incident of 1952. It's not the greatest case in the world, but it's not the worst. It's from a newspaper, actually, that the CIA clipped and kept it. And they emphasized not for evaluation. Okay, fine. But it's a heck of a story. And basically what you've got is from March 29th, 1952. This is east of the Luapula River over the southern part of the Belgian Congo, which, by the way, was later renamed Zaire and is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Anyway, the report tells us that there were two fiery discs that were seen moving overhead, and then they were hovering over the uranium mines that were located in a district known as the Elizabethville district. And by the way, that was an extremely important uranium mine, one of the highest quality in the world, and very, very important for the development of nuclear weapons. Just saying. According to the report, the objects flew over the mine. They looked like plates at times. They looked like ovals. It all depended on your position from the ground. Sometimes they looked like just lines in the sky. The objects were seen hovering for a while, then they would instantly take off, moving like in zigzag fashion. And this whole thing went on, they said, for 10 or 12 minutes. Then a fighter pilot was dispatched to investigate and hopefully intercept. All we know is his name was Commander Pierre. And he pursued these objects. He got very close to one of them. It looked like he might succeed. And apparently he saw some incredible detail. Let me just move on to the quote there. The inner core remained absolutely still, and the knob coming out from the center and several small openings, I think it should be, could plainly be seen. The outer rim was completely veiled in fire and must have had an enormous speed of rotation. The color of the metal was similar to that of aluminum. And according to the report, the object could move in a precise and light manner, both vertically and horizontally. That's in the words of the report. And it could do it in a very rapid manner. So the pilot, Pierre, noticed that both objects could drop to within 20 meters of the treetops before they would zip back into the sky. When they departed, he estimated the speed to be at about 1,500 kilometers per hour. If you don't do kph, that's 930 miles per hour. And just as a point of comparison, the world's top airspeed at that time was quite a lot less than that. It was about 670 miles per hour in the spring of 1952. When the world did catch up to that speed a number of years later, it goes without saying, those aircraft did not look like fiery discs, and they did not have the ability to hover, nor did they have the ability to change altitude, let alone quickly. Well, they could do it gradually, but not quickly, or do any of the things that you get reported in this encounter, or countless other military reports that we have of UFOs from the 50s, from the 60s, and on and on. So not surprisingly, that event from 1952 is utterly unexplained in any conventional sense. So that when you really look into reports like this one and so many others, it is easy to conclude that someone had technology that just was not supposed to exist. And when you look around the world in 1952 for answers, you just come up empty over and over again. You don't have the Russians, you don't have the Brits, you don't have the Chinese, you don't have anyone else, really, which leads you to the obvious possibility that someone else from somewhere else was responsible. But here's the thing. So fast forward now to today. We're moving fast into a new world. And one thing is the soon-to-be universal presence of drones in our skies. And, oh yeah, flying cars. That's a whole thing now. Now, right now, the capability, and by flying cars, like literally flying cars, that you will, in theory, you won't be flying them, but they'll be automated. You'll have an automated program that will take you from one place to another. It's like you're being carried in a drone delivery, your own flying car. So right now, the capabilities of these things isn't really likely to blow us away. The whole flying car thing, it is interesting, and surprisingly, I think there are reasons it can happen pretty soon. But anyway, they're not very fast at this time. So we can guess that before long, you'll see higher and faster speeds. Like there's an interesting future there. I think we can kind of acknowledge that this could be quite a fascinating thing. Like, who thought the Jetsons would actually happen? But a flying car, possibility. Probably with faster speeds. And it's quite possible there's going to be a lot more aerial traffic in the next decade than what we're seeing now. And some of that traffic may be getting more and more technologically sophisticated. And for that reason alone, you have to wonder if it's going to be tougher to study UAP or UFOs as the main evidence pointing to the existence of other beings among us. It's a strange thing to consider, but researchers have been wondering about this for quite a while. Our own aerial tech is poised right now, very, very soon, if not already, to be at the level where if you see something you might think could be a flying saucer, how can you possibly know if it isn't something man-made? We've been asking this question for a while already, of course, for many decades, in fact, but it's more urgent now than I think ever before. And you have to wonder, how long will it be before someone rolls out some sort of flying saucer type of vehicle? As crazy as it might seem, it's entirely possible. Which leads to the question, if you're interested in determining whether or not there are aliens living here on Earth, or at least visiting and hanging out, are there other forms of evidence we could be looking at? What anomalies might we be looking for, which would point to non-human intelligences here? So I'm going to show you a couple of little slides. One might be artifacts. And I think this is of, there's a number of these that have been out there. They've been of potential great importance. So this one you see an image of, this is a famous metamaterial that was sent to Art Bell of Coast to Coast Radio back in the 1990s, which Linda Moulton Howe curated this particular piece for many years, and which Hal Puthoff referred to this in a lecture that he gave back in 2018, which is apparently one heck of an unexplained bit of material. Right now, that artifact, and I think possibly others, is in the joint custody of To the Stars Academy and the U.S. Army, a project known as the CRADA Project, which is providing testing facilities for TTSA. And we're told that the results will be made public. So, okay, let's see how that turns out, because it is of genuine potential significance. So artifacts, that's one definite thing where, we can ask ourselves, this is an area of study. Another would be implants. So that's another type of an artifact, are alleged alien implants that abductees have had removed from their bodies. And I say abductees because these are people who remember alien abduction events. And they've also had bizarre objects removed from their bodies. The late Dr. Roger Lear is probably best known for doing this work. And at least some of the objects have been studied in detail, and they're extremely interesting. Lear studied, I don't know how many of these people he actually studied. I think at least 15 of the implants directly that he personally removed from people. I have one interesting quote from Roger, which he gave, I think, back in 2009. He said, "You can line them up on a surgical drape and not be able to tell one from the other." And the thing about those objects, he gave a lot of lectures and a lot of information on it. They were typically just a couple of millimeters long. They could be as long as a centimeter and as thin as pencil lead. So Lear was amazed during each surgery by the lack of inflammation, the lack of rejection reaction in any of the subjects. In his view, this would be impossible with the current known technologies. No point of entry was visible in any of these implants, nor there was any scarring visible. Each implant appeared to have a very tough biological type of coating, which presumably accounted for, pardon me, the lack of inflammation. Lear actually said that the coating was so tough that a surgical blade couldn't cut through it. So really quite remarkable. But then there were technological properties of these implants that were, I mean, just quite extraordinary. When one of the objects was seen under the microscope, it seemed to contain nanofibers, which were very similar in appearance to carbon nanotubes, which definitely suggested engineering and not something natural like a meteor fragment, which is what some skeptics have suggested for these things. Another thing is the object was also magnetic. The one particular one that Lear gave a detailed analysis of, I should say, and it gave off a radio frequency in the range of 14.7 megahertz, so very specific frequency. Lear had a partner giving this one particular lecture named Dr. Alex Mosier, who suggested, who believed, and Mosier is a PhD physical chemist, I believe, who suggested that this was a functional device that may serve to monitor or control. Well, that's pretty interesting indeed. But as fascinating as that is, there is a tremendous need for research on alleged alien implants to continue and to go even deeper. Of course, we can do this. It seems like a no-brainer. Like we should be able to continue with the research that Roger Lear was so proficient at. This is a potentially widespread phenomenon in which something very specific can, in fact, be found, recovered, and studied. It's an obvious avenue for future research. So that's one. Now, another area that we could be studying, let me just move on to another visual here, claims of alien encounters. In addition to studying physical artifacts we can get hold of, we can also be very, I think we'd be wise if we were to keep getting stories, collecting stories of encounters from people who are claiming to have had alien encounters. So I'm talking about, whether it's an abduction or a non-abduction type of experience, because you get them both. There's a lot of individuals who are quite adamant that they have had such encounters. And when you go through the history of some of them, well, some of them are very compelling, in my opinion. Someone's personal subjective memory of an encounter with an alien is not going to be as scientifically measurable as an alien implant or as a metamaterial, but it is potentially of very, very great significance. So let me just move on here and get to the next slide. My mouse just got stuck there. So we want to keep alien accounts, alive. We want to keep talking to people who've had them. Next, document research. And along with that, I would say fighting for government transparency. Now, since 2017, here, let me get this off here. Since 2017, we've taken a few public steps to bring the UFO subject to the rest of the world. And for my part, I'm very happy with that development. And of course, we're still at the level of baby steps, so let's not get too excited. But there's something that's been going on, and it is important. What we need definitely is much greater transparency relating to UFOs coming from all of the world governments, in my opinion, and definitely from their militaries, and especially that of the United States. We know that there have been many, many military encounters with extraordinary unknown objects, not just the Tic Tac UFO of 2004, not just the encounters of the USS Roosevelt in 2015. We've had a long, long history of encounters, many of which thankfully have been well documented by past researchers. But there's always more to dig out, which makes us all curious, I'm sure, about the recent announcement by the U.S. Senate Intelligence Committee regarding their establishment of a UAP task force that's supposed to, we're told, report to Congress and presumably to the public. Well, that would be nice to get some new confirmed data on this. We will see how that all turns out. But it's clearly an important direction we need to go in. This type of thing is the type of thing we actually really need. And, I don't know how much information we're really ever going to get out of that, but the thing is, if such a task force exists, it could actually serve as a kind of wedge for the public, or something to pry open more information. Project Blue Book served that role back in the 50s and 60s when it existed as an official UFO body. Blue Book spokespeople lied about UFOs all the time, but Blue Book was still valuable to have, and I think the UAP task force similarly could be quite valuable to have for a lot of reasons. So that's 4. So 5, leaks and whistleblowers is another area that really UFO research needs to continue to look at. Now, that's beyond official government channels, beyond FOIA documentation. There's always this possibility of getting fresh information on UFO data from things like government leaks. And I move my mouse here. Sorry, excuse me. Okay. And here's the thing, whether the leaks are legal or not is almost kind of irrelevant, since increasingly it may not be possible to stop, to differentiate one from the other. We've been in the age of WikiLeaks for like 15 years now, and there's all kinds of private groups out there that are just dying to get their hands on some kind of military UFO document. It's something I've wondered about for more than a decade, and we're still waiting, but it doesn't mean it can't happen, and only that it just hasn't happened yet. And I should point out, leaks aren't always illegal. There's insiders with access to sensitive information all the time, and frequently they have relayed things to myself and other researchers legally. And I will emphasize, information that, like, they may have security clearances, but they will provide something that is legal that they are allowed to do, and throwing important hints to researchers like myself and others. They do this all the time. Now, of course, the problem is that if it's legal for them to tell us, the information is probably not going to be as explosive as the information that they can't tell you. But even so, researchers need to be ready at all times to take in information from any and all insider sources that they can talk to. You never know. You never know when you run into someone. You may shock yourself and run into a stranger who is in the military and offers you information on secret bases or an alien presence on planet Earth. Don't laugh. It's happened a number of times. I learned of such an encounter quite recently from someone where I don't know how far or easily it will be able to look into that to confirm it, but maybe we'll see. So I got a couple more possibilities here of things that I think we're going to want to be looking at in the future. This one, biological, and we'll say genetic tests. This part is definitely out there, as it were, but consider, what if you had an extraordinary experience, close encounter with a UFO, say, or even had an encounter with an alien being? There is a theory encompassing the science of epigenetics that suggests that there will be a specific genetic marker in the aftermath of that encounter. It's a fascinating possibility. And we do know that there is research currently underway that supposedly is all about trying to find that evidence, and probably a bunch of things related to that. It's been frustrating for me to get hard confirmation of the science and of any of the results, but I think this is still in progress. But the rumors have been floating through the UFO community for quite some time, and it does seem to me that there's potentially valuable information waiting there for us. Now, more generally, you might ask yourself an even more far-out question. What if there are actually, wait for it, what if there are actually aliens walking among us? That is the title of the last book by Dr. David Jacobs, Walking Among Us. And without a doubt, there's a strong argument he makes there that we are dealing with, at least in part, a group of human-looking beings who are actually human-alien hybrids. They're walking among us. There's a good interview I did with Dr. Jacobs on this channel. You can hear David and I discuss all of this, and I would encourage you, if you haven't checked it out, to do so. But the thing is, what if it's true? Like, what if it is true? Could there ever be a way to test someone genetically for an alien connection? I know it seems totally sci-fi, and maybe it is, but if you accept the scenario as at least possible, you would want to know how to detect them, if that is even possible, and it may not be. And then 7, new aerial detection technologies. So how many major UFO sightings have there been lately? Well, as I was saying earlier, thousands are reported every year, but how many do we have that we've actually been paying attention to? How many have engaged the attention of the general public? Basically, none recently. And it's not to say that there aren't any good cases, just that none of them are being discussed at all. You know, we had a bunch 10 years ago or more. There was the Stevensville, Texas UFO event of 2008, very interesting case. You had the 2006 Chicago O'Hare Airport sighting, definitely interesting. And there are more recent ones as well that are good sightings, but just nothing that people have really latched onto that's really captured our imagination. And I think a big part of this is simply because most cases don't really get a chance to get a proper investigation. And a lot of my concern about how to investigate UFOs in the future would be dissipated if we could magically find a way to hire an army of dedicated investigators of these many reports. Since it's pretty obvious that that's not going to happen, we should look at alternative means of gathering UFO data. And one key, I've got an image of it right here, to keep the study of UFOs alive and fresh is by developing new ways to detect them. As our own tech gets more and more advanced, you would need new filters so that you would only pick up objects that seem anomalous, objects that don't make sense. And there are some good ideas being worked on. One that I've got an image of here is called SkyHub. And that's a software and hardware system developed by someone that I know quite well. That's Dr. Bob McGuire, whom I've also interviewed on this program. You can go through the archives and look for that. Of course, Bob didn't do this alone. He had has a fine group, a team of people involved. There's a number of components to what they're trying to do there. One being the creation of a kind of passive radar receiver that makes use of existing broadcast or radar transmitters to track unusual objects. It's very ingenious. You have to have the right kind of filters in place, and you can develop an ability to find some strange things. I have no doubt that there are other clever ideas out there just waiting to be implemented. And by the way, some of these ought to include the ability to detect objects in Earth orbit or beyond, as well as within bodies of water. I can imagine both of these would be daunting at the least, mainly because of the vast majority of us just aren't in Earth orbit, or we're not inside large bodies of water. But if we can find a way in future to get detection equipment in place to do this, well, I think we would all be interested in what we may find, right? In terms of space, we all see that the commercialization of space is starting to happen. So you wonder, will the fact that a bunch of private companies develop the ability to go into Earth orbit enable them to spill the beans to the public about UFOs out there? That would be nice. I think we can all agree. It doesn't look, at least currently, that any commercial entities that are out there would be free of the long arm of the U.S. national security state. I just don't think so. That seems to include SpaceX or Bigelow Aerospace or any other company, for that matter, that gets out there. Maybe the day will come when the Department of Defense doesn't control all the information coming from there, but it looks like they are still running the show today, that's for sure. At least as long as commercial companies are seeking defense contracts and needing to get cleared for classified information, which seems to be the case. And you have to wonder how long that situation can last, but maybe a long time. In theory, there are chances for independent investigators to learn about anomalies in space. We've had this happen in the past, and there's people who've watched NASA video footage. The late Jeff Challenger over from Sacramento, California, someone I knew who did this quite a bit, and he was quite dedicated. And there are others, quite a few others. I'm sure that will continue in the future, and how effective they will be is something, well, we're just going to have to wait and see. Maybe there will be next-gen UFO research tools that, like high-altitude drones for the public, for example. Will that ever be possible? Will the general public be able to get anything into low Earth orbit? Maybe not. Certainly the laws don't look very favorable to that at this time. But the thing is, the better visibility you have in the sky, the more likely you're going to have a good chance of getting some decent data. And I wouldn't rule any of that out for the future. So these are a few areas of study that future UFO research ought to be looking into. And I'm sure there's others that I'm missing here, but that's a good start. And you can see, I would never recommend abandoning classical UFO investigation and reporting, not at all. But I think it's more appropriate to recognize that the traditional methods of investigating are going to seem very, very limited if we don't expand how we are doing this. Like, what if we are really talking about, in other words, we're talking about something more than unidentified flying objects and more than unknown aerial phenomena. That phenomena is never going to go away. That's important. But really what we are talking about in the future, I think, is more like gathering evidence of anomalies in our civilization in general. Maybe we can call it that, or it's something much broader than just UFOs. And we should keep in mind that new detection methods, while definitely desirable, aren't really quite here yet. They're not in place. The military has a system in place where they've got a whole array of satellites that, in theory, can be used to detect and share data about UFOs. In fact, this was suggested by TTSA's Chris Mellon not long ago. And at least this is one of the things being discussed in the recent UAP task force proposed by the Senate Intelligence Committee. It's funny, you would think the military would have such a system fully in place. Maybe they do, and no one knows about it. But the word is that none of the agencies that control the various satellites are interested in the idea of sharing what they get with those satellites with other agencies. So you've got the problem of stovepiping valuable data that essentially goes nowhere. And, it's possible that there is an organization that is able to collect it all, but we just don't know about it. But it's all that the U.S. military, at least the bulk of the U.S. military, does not get access to a unified system of data provided by all of its satellites in relation to UFOs, which was the point of suggesting that they do so in the Senate bill. Well, military satellites have amazing capabilities that civilian tech doesn't match. But it doesn't mean we can't develop new technologies in the future that give us important data as well. But I mean, there's no guarantee that we are going to develop or employ any of these new technologies or systems. Right now, despite some promising leads, it's all still a matter of waiting for the future. Sometimes the future arrives like you expect it, and maybe more often than not, it doesn't. So it's conceivable that as time goes by, the evidence provided by UFO sightings and connecting those sightings to alien life forms or some secret civilizations, this may become more and more difficult to do with just straight up UFO reports, and it may become impossible to do. It means that the investigation into looking for anomalies in our world, again, needs to broaden. We need to be thinking in broader terms than just UFOs. We are looking at a near future in which it may become virtually impossible, in other words, to analyze all the potentially advanced aerial craft and drones that are very likely going to be coming out over the next decade or two. Now, what if there is an alien agenda? Because all these questions become interesting if we consider that there is an alien agenda going on, which, look, there certainly probably is. I mean, if you have to assume that if they are here, all right, that's the first assumption, admittedly, but if they're here, they would probably have some sort of agenda. I think it would be silly to think that there wouldn't be an agenda. Now, okay, no one agrees on that agenda, but I would say that at the very least, you have to consider the potential need for some urgency on this matter of future UFO research or future alien research, if there's any possibility of a negative agenda. Personally, I think it's naive in the extreme to deny any possibility that there's a negative agenda. I can't understand when there are people who make this blanket statement. I'm not suggesting that all aliens are bad. I don't know. And I don't pretend to know. But there is definitely an argument to be made that we should, at the very least, be very cautious about these other beings. And there's another reason for some urgency to revamping UFO research. We are in the midst of a major transformation. I've been calling it the fourth stage of humanity. The entire pandemic has accelerated our movement into this stage. This is a new and highly controlled phase of human existence. It's going to result in the heightened amount of control and information about every single human being in the hands of their government and other corporate and financial interests, for that matter. From universal 5G tech that's being rolled out right now, to all the monitoring and listening methods that are already today almost universal, to the fact that, as everyone can now see, jobs will be permanently going away for many, many people. Sure, there will be new jobs, I imagine. There always are. But sorry, we are moving to an era in which there is simply going to be a lot of extra people with not much to do. It's a world that will, therefore, require total mind control and physical control over billions and billions of people. And you can see it happening. It's happening right before our eyes as we sit here. So with the pandemic and the lockdowns, we're just seeing these trends speed up. They were happening already. They're just going way faster. Also, like, just off the top of my head, like with the pandemic, you can see we're getting a movement toward a cashless society. More and more you hear this being discussed, so that all of the transactions you make in your life are completely trackable. Sure, what could possibly go wrong with that? Then there's UBI, Universal Basic Income. That is definitely a big part of the global conversation now in a way that just was not happening even a year ago. You get UBI, sounds like a real great fun party. Well, good. You can be a happy ward of the state, because that's what you are. Your income is going to be supported by the government. You will be a docile little ward of that government. All forms of control, social control in every way imaginable is being ramped up. Social distancing laws. I was just reading Australia is arresting people for not wearing masks, or for going onto Facebook and complaining about masks and trying to organize resistance. Like, I don't think it's just Australia. I think this is happening in many places. So there's this, all of that. Then you've got excessive digitization of control, which is basically everywhere now. So it gives us the sense that time is running short for us to get our act together to deal with this situation, while we will still have some ability to leverage information out of our governments. Or have we already lost any of that leveraging ability already? Maybe we have. But it's very possibly something that will get worse, not better, as we move into the future. So I was saying not long ago that I think we need to consider that the recent UFO revelations coming out since 2017 that have reached mainstream media may very well be slowing down. I did a whole presentation on this not long ago. We may be at a new standstill for the next coming period of time. It seems odd for everyone has been so excited and, about all the latest revelations that have come through the U.S. Navy and TTSA and so on. But it could stop. And it could stop for quite a while. It could be for 5 years or 10 years or more, in which we do not move forward. And I really try to explain this a lot in my one of my recent videos. But essentially, it comes down to there may not be any further tangible evidence that researchers are able to provide to the rest of the world in terms of crash retrievals, because that's really the next step that we're coming to now. The New York Times is put it out there saying kind of, sort of, maybe crash retrievals, but they haven't confirmed it. That's where we're at. And that level of confirmation could stop right where it is for a long time, essentially moving the cover-up simply to another place on the field, but still cover-up, I would say. So yeah, we have moved a lot in the last 3 years, but there are clear boundaries that are still in place in which it is obvious you just don't go past. And the number one boundary is genuine discussion of the UFO cover-up itself. You know, I mentioned crash retrievals, that's important, but the only reason crash retrievals are so dicey to talk about is because they clearly prove a massive UFO cover-up has been in place. You know, they can go on and pretend that we don't know what these things are, as long as they act as though they've never recovered any of the artifacts. Like once they've recovered an artifact or a craft, you can't pretend that you don't know what these things are. You have to admit that you've lied to the public for a long, long time. And that's what no one in that system wants to do. You will notice that over the last 3 years, there has been no detailed examination from the mainstream of one simple question, which is if there are truly such anomalous objects being encountered by our military, like the Tic Tac or whatever, then is there any reason to go back and look at the claims of a deep UFO cover-up? Shouldn't we be looking at the possibility that there's been a long-standing cover-up? Like, it's an obvious question, and it has not been asked by anyone in the mainstream of our society. I haven't seen it anywhere. So there are definite limits to our public conversation on UFOs ever since this whole thing has started to get revitalized in 2017. The sense of urgency. It is entirely feasible that the disclosure progress just pauses. And at the same time, we see a continued consolidation of digital media, continued consolidation of the legal system globally to congeal our ability to generate fresh information about all of this. So yeah, that's where we possibly are. I'm getting close to wrapping this up here. Let me ask you this. How possible will it be to engage the broader public on the matter of UFOs? So think of 2020, this year, this insane year. A lot of news on UFOs has come out with a little bit of a bump in public consciousness, but a lot less than many of us would have thought. And that's because there have been many things competing for our attention this year. Coronavirus, lockdowns, economic meltdown, protests or riots, depending on your preferred phrase for that one, the election, the general insanity in our world, etc., etc. So we are right now lurching from crisis to crisis. The U.S. election is less than 2 months away, and we are all in terror at the prospect, no matter who you want to win. We all know that there is very likely going to be major unrest as a result of this coming election. And we all now have a pretty good idea of what that unrest is likely going to look like. And then there's the economic situation, just waiting for the other shoe to drop, a spiraling economic downturn that takes us from bad to worse. That is entirely possible. So with UFO news, I mean, you can see it could easily be relegated to the back burner for a long time to come. It may be seen as very unimportant compared with all the other craziness happening in the world, along with the greater and greater levels of control that people are experiencing and starting to resist sporadically now around the world. The thing that will keep the ball moving forward will be either to publicize new UFO revelations, whatever those might be, something significant that will cause a new public conversation. This could easily come from the world of UFO research, in which someone provides strong information that people are just going to want to hear or see. Absolutely. Or, and this brings us back to an old refrain, we actually obtain some form of government UFO disclosure or confirmation. It seems ridiculous that we, at this point, should still be begging for scraps from our government for information and confirmation about UFOs. But keep in mind that the government is supposed to work for the people. Yes, we all know it's not that way in practice. We all know that. But in theory, in legal theory, it is. And as long as we have even that legal fiction on our side, we can indeed demand answers from our respective governments. It's that simple. And it's actually critically important to get that admission. It's easy to be cynical and to claim it's not important because governments always lie. Yes, they do. They always lie. We know that. But that's still not the point. It's not the point. The public needs an admission that it has been lied to for a whole bunch of reasons. And one of them is simply psychological. If you've been gaslit for an entire lifetime, like, it's just not a good situation. And at some point, we deserve to have this information cleanly delivered to us in a relatively truthful manner. Okay? But there's a whole bunch of other reasons why we need to do this, including political and for our own safety. Like, at some point, this is going to have to come out. And by the way, it's just going to be impossible to keep it secret forever. But as I was saying, it could stay secret for a while. You know, it could stay secret for a while. And we can see that, those people who have the power in this situation, they don't want to look at the implications of a lifetime of deception and secrecy, gaslighting the public for years. So we see there's a tremendous unwillingness to go into this issue, the issue that we've been lied to. But my goodness, we need that admission. We have gone so long, so very long. And I can tell you all of us need to get that truth. But it's the truth on this subject that is so very explosive. And which is why getting that truth is going to be one hell of a challenge. Not just for the next few years, but for a long time to come. I will expect that over time we get new information on this subject that may well turn out to be very helpful. But nothing is certain. Don't take anything for granted. We're living in a different world now, and we are not going back to the old days. It's not going to happen. UFO research will, in all likelihood, be on its own, very possibly for a while to come. And if that is so, we need to think out of the box and continue to develop research tools and methods of investigation that are going to help us get to the truth and to get those confirmations that we all want. Well, that's what I got for you tonight. Thanks for listening. I always enjoy our time here. If you like this channel, and if you like what I do, please do consider supporting me by subscribing and by smashing that like button. You can also consider checking out my website, richarddolanmembers.com, where my wife Tracy and I are constantly putting up fresh content. And remember, while we learn and grow and search for the truth, let's be good to each other. Later.